Fossils. A fossil is either a preserved piece or an impression of an animal or plant that died long ago. Fossils are preserved in the Earth's crust. The word fossil comes from a Latin word meaning to dig. The soft parts of dead animals rot away quickly. They don't stay preserved. Fossils usually come from the hard parts, like a tooth or bone. A fossil may also come from the imprint of a leaf or fish scales on soft material that later hardens. The science of fossils is called paleontology. By studying fossils, scientists can trace animal life back to its earliest forms. Although people had been finding fossils for a long time, when Charles lived, scientists didn't understand much about them. In 1842, a British scientist named Richard Owen invented the term dinosaur to describe unusual fossil bones that had been found. Dinosaur means terrible lizard. But it wasn't until after Charles published his theory of evolution in 1859 that scientists began to piece together the puzzle of fossils. Chapter 4. To the Galapagos. By the summer of 1834, Charles had been gone nearly 3 years. He'd explored many wild places. He'd visited Patagonia, Rio de Janeiro, Uruguay, and Buenos Aires. As the Beagle reached the southernmost tip of South America, Captain Fitzroy steered the ship carefully through the Strait of Magellan. The Beagle entered the Pacific Ocean safely and sailed up the western coast of South America. The trip had been full of adventure and danger. One time, Charles and the other sailors were on Tierra del Fuego, an island near the southern tip of South America. Suddenly, a huge piece of ice fell from a nearby cliff. When it hit the sea, the waves rose high. Charles thought quickly. Together, he and a sailor rushed to pull their small boat farther up the beach before it was smashed by the waves. Captain Fitzroy stopped in the town of Valparaiso in Chile. The Beagle needed repairs. Charles was glad for some time on land. He was eager to get letters from home. Charles walked all the way to Santiago, the capital city. On the way back, he became very ill and was sick for 6 weeks. Up to this time, Charles had been a healthy young man. After this, he had stomach problems for the rest of his life. Charles longed to go home and almost sailed back to England on another ship. Soon after, for the first time in his life, Charles saw a volcano erupt. He also experienced an earthquake. He was so excited he could barely sleep. For months, he'd been reading Lyell's book about the Earth and how the Earth had been formed by natural forces. Now Charles saw this for himself. He felt the Earth shake. He saw cracks open in the ground. He found bits of seashells at the top of hills. How had they gotten there? He felt sure that long ago the land had been underwater. He thought that the hills had risen up over time after volcanic eruptions. Charles was sure Lyell was right. Natural forces like volcanoes had changed Earth in the past, and the Earth was still changing. Charles climbed high into the Andes Mountains and took in everything with new, curious eyes. The shape of the rocks, the valleys below, the gravel at his feet. He tried to imagine the past, when these mountains had been pushed up from the sea by volcanic forces. On one peak, Charles stopped to look at the glorious view. The sky was an intense blue. Wild, broken rocks lay below him. Patches of snow shone from other peaks. More and more, Charles was seeing the world as a scientist. But the beauty of nature always moved him. After leaving South America, the Beagle continued westward. The next stop was the Galapagos Islands, off the coast of Ecuador. The Beagle arrived there on September 15, 1835. This was the high point for Charles. He was eager to see the amazing creatures, volcanoes, and lava fields of the Galapagos Islands. Although few people lived on these islands, for years whaling ships had stopped to hunt and fish. Sailors were fond of capturing the giant Galapagos tortoises, which were a good source of food. They could stay alive in a ship's hold for months before being eaten. Charles was fascinated by the giant tortoises. Males can weigh up to 500 pounds and measure 5 or 6 feet from head to tail. It seemed to Charles as if they were creatures from another planet. Charles set off to explore. He found strange marine iguanas, which slept on warm rocks in the sun. When they got hungry, they crawled into the ocean to feed on seaweed. Charles had never seen swimming iguanas before. He wondered how these creatures, so different from any other, had come to live here. The Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands lie in the Pacific Ocean, 600 miles west of Ecuador. They consist of 13 major islands and 6 smaller islands. The word Galapagos means tortoises in Spanish. Many species on the islands live nowhere else on Earth. About 14,000 people live in the Galapagos. Each year, thousands of tourists visit, but unlike Charles Darwin, they can't take specimens home. The Galapagos National Park protects the islands. Charles was the first scientist to visit the Galapagos. Today, scientists at the Charles Darwin Research Station follow in his footsteps. Chapter 5: Secret Notebooks. From the Galapagos Islands, the Beagle headed west to Tahiti in the South Pacific. Then, it sailed to New Zealand and Australia, and into the Indian Ocean. On the island of Mauritius, Charles had a special treat: an elephant ride. He was surprised such a large animal walked so quietly. After a stop in South Africa, the Beagle sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and headed for England. The ship docked on October 2nd, 1836. 3 days later, Charles was back home. He was glad to see his father and the rest of his family. He'd been away for 5 long years. The Beagle voyage had changed Charles's life. He was ready to pursue a career as a scientist. His father accepted this. There was no more talk of Charles becoming a minister. Right away, Charles set to work. Soon, he was meeting famous scientists, like geologist Charles Lyell, whose book he'd read. Now the two became close friends. Charles also began turning his Beagle diary into a book and spent hours sorting his collections. Charles needed the help of experts to identify his finds, so he gave away many specimens to museums. The museum experts told him some of his fossils did belong to unknown animals. Then came even more astonishing news. John Gould was an ornithologist. a scientist who studies birds. Gould examined the finches Charles took from the Galapagos Islands. He looked at their feathers, the shape of their beaks, the length of their bones, and other things. He wanted to know where each finch came from. But that wasn't possible, because the birds hadn't been labeled that way. Charles contacted Captain Fitzroy and other crew members who'd also collected specimens. With their help, Gould and Charles were able to identify which finches came from which islands. Then, Gould told Charles something astonishing. Birds on one island were not the same species as birds from another island. They were different species. Charles was amazed. He knew that in South America, there was only one finch that looked like the finches in the Galapagos Islands. Charles had assumed that the South American finch and all the Galapagos Island finches belonged to the same species. But John Gould said that was wrong. So Charles came up with some ideas about what might have happened. Charles thought that perhaps some finches of the South American species had gone to the Galapagos Islands long ago. Maybe a storm had blown them there. So at first, there had been only one species of finch on all the different islands. Then somehow, from a common ancestor, the finches on various islands changed over time, or evolved into different species. If the finches had changed, thought Charles, maybe other creatures could change too. He hadn't forgotten the giant armadillo fossils that he'd found. Charles couldn't help wondering if the armadillo fossils were related to the smaller, live armadillos he'd eaten. With his own eyes, Charles had seen that changes on Earth could take place through natural forces like volcanoes. Wasn't it possible then that plants and animals could also change through natural force? But what was that force, and how did it work? Charles didn't yet know, but he made up his mind to find out. And so began one of the most exciting times in Charles Darwin's life. He was on fire with questions. He poured his ideas into notebooks, which he carried everywhere. He wrote at the library, where he read book after book. He scribbled down thoughts while bumping along London streets in a carriage. Charles also talked to people who work with animals and plants. At the time, no one really understood inheritance. That is how traits are passed from one generation to another, like brown eyes, for example. But Charles guessed inheritance might be an important part of the puzzle. So Charles asked his barber, who raised dogs, about breeding hounds with good hunting instincts. He also went to the zoo, looked at the animals, and chatted with zookeepers. Charles asked questions, listened carefully, and looked closely. Yet, he never told anyone why he was so curious. Charles was leading a double life. To the outside world, he was a rising star in science. He was famous for his voyage on the Beagle and his collections. He was invited to join important groups of scientists. But secretly, Charles was trying to solve a scientific puzzle. He didn't dare tell anyone what he was working on. Almost everyone Charles knew believed God had created the world in just 6 days. The first horses and the first birds looked exactly the same at the beginning of creation as horses and birds did in Charles's time. People weren't ready to accept that the world as they knew it had came into being very slowly, and that it was still changing. By October of 1838, Charles had a theory to explain how creatures could change. A lot of his thinking came from reading a book about human populations. Charles realized that living creatures produce lots of offspring. Birds, for instance, have many babies. But the world isn't overrun with birds. There aren't enough resources, enough space or food for all of them. Some birds die before they can have babies of their own. Others live longer. They are better fit to survive and have babies of their own. Charles knew there are many small differences or variations in individual members of a species. Take the finches in the Galapagos Islands. At one time, long ago, there probably had been only one species on all the islands. Even so, not all those finches looked exactly alike. For example, some finches might have been born with slightly thicker beaks than others. On an island with lots of hard seeds to eat, it was probably easier for the finches with thicker beaks to eat seeds. Finches with longer, narrower beaks would have had a harder time picking them up. So, on this island, the long-beaked birds might not have lived as long. Charles understood that a finch can't change the shape of its beak during its lifetime. But he figured finches with short, thick beaks that can eat more food have a good chance of surviving long enough to have babies or offspring of their own. Their offspring will be part of the next generation of finches. If babies in the next generation inherit thick beaks, they too will be better fit to survive and have offspring of their own. In other words, if the fit members are having the most babies, then each generation is more fit. The helpful trait, the thick beak, gets passed down, while unfit traits, for example, the long, narrow beak, don't get passed down as much. So, each generation is more fit to survive. In this way, over many generations, the populations of finches on the island with hard seeds are adapting to their environment. Over time, the population may change so much that it may eventually become a separate species. In the Galapagos Islands, over time, the finch population on an island with hard seeds to eat came to have thick, powerful beaks. Charles guessed that this same force could explain changes in other creatures, such as the armadillos. He didn't know exactly what had happened, but he suspected that fossils could help provide important clues. Charles understood that all creatures struggle to survive. The struggle causes populations of plants, animals, and even bacteria to change. Charles called this force natural selection. Charles now had the key to part of the evolution puzzle. He had figured out something very important, but he wasn't ready to share his ideas with the world. What is a species? A species is a group of similar plants or animals. Scientists usually identify a species in two ways. First, all members of the same species share similar characteristics. Second, individuals of the same species can mate with one another. For example, there are many different breeds of dogs, but all dogs belong to the same species. They share traits or characteristics from their common ancestors. They can mate and have puppies. A beagle and a collie will have puppies that are half beagle, half collie, and all dog. An eagle and a sparrow are different species. Although eagles and sparrows are both birds and both can fly, there are many things about them that are different. They can't mate and have babies successfully. That's because they are different species. Every plant or animal species has two parts in its scientific name. The first part is the genus, a group of several similar species. The second part is the particular species. For instance, big cats belong to the group Panthera. A tiger is Panthera tigris, while a lion is Panthera leo. They are two different species. Some species, like zebras and giraffes, are easy to tell apart. But, just like Charles Darwin, even today scientists sometimes have a hard time telling one species from another. The Regents Park Zoo. Charles Darwin liked to visit the Regents Park Zoo in London, where he could see a rhinoceros, an orangutan, and an elephant. The English had long been fascinated with exotic animals. King Henry I, 1100 to 1135, kept lions and leopards given to him by foreign kings. In the 1200s, King Henry III was given 3 leopards, a white bear, and an African elephant. By 1821, the Tower Menagerie contained over 280 animals. People could pay a few pennies to see them. These animals became the core of the Regents Park Zoo, which opened in 1828. In 1851, when the Darwins spent a week in London, they took their children to the zoo. It is still a very popular spot in London.